She had stood beside a king at his coronation. She had worn a crown that once seemed impossible for a woman like her. She had traveled the long, hard road from the most hated woman in Britain to the Queen of England. And yet, on a quiet morning inside the walls of one of the most famous palaces in the world, none of that seemed to matter anymore, because the lawyers had made something official. The diamonds, the ones that had sparkled on Queen Elizabeth's neck for 7 decades, were going to Catherine, not to Camilla, not to the woman who sat beside the king at every state banquet, who carried the weight of the crown on her shoulders every single day. The woman who had waited longer than almost anyone to be accepted, to be respected, to be called queen. She was not getting the diamonds, and the people who knew her best said she was not taking it well. This is the story of a royal inheritance that shook the palace from the inside, not the kind of story that makes the front pages with a dramatic photograph. The kind of story that lives in closed rooms, in legal documents, in the quiet fury of a woman who had expected something different. The kind of story the royal family never officially confirms and never officially denies. And the kind of story that, once you understand the full picture, tells you everything about how power really moves inside the British monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was 96 years old, and she had spent more than 70 years on the throne. When she passed, she left behind not just a legacy of service and duty, but one of the most extraordinary private jewelry collections ever assembled by a single human being. The numbers alone are staggering. The Queen's personal jewelry collection, the private pieces that belonged specifically to her and not to the crown, numbered around 300 individual items. These were not simply pretty things to wear. They were heirlooms that had traveled across centuries, through wars and abdications and the slow unraveling of the British Empire. Some had been worn by Queen Victoria. Some had been gifted by foreign governments. Some had been passed from mother to daughter across 5 generations. Queen Elizabeth's collection had been growing for over 400 years, with each piece handed down through various branches of the British royal family. Style cast her something about rocks. And now, with the Queen gone, the question of who would receive what became one of the most sensitive, and, as it turned out, one of the most quietly explosive conversations in the modern history of the royal family. The answer, when it finally became clear, was not what everyone had expected. From the very beginning, there was a hierarchy. That is the word that royal experts used again and again in the weeks after Elizabeth died. Hierarchy. The British royal family operates according to rules that are older than most countries, and when it comes to who receives what from a departed monarch, those rules are specific. Royal expert Katie Nicholl explained that there is a hierarchy in all of this. The Queen Consort gets first choice of the Queen's jewelry, and after that is the Princess of Wales. On paper, that meant Camilla had priority. She was the Queen now. She was the woman sitting at the top of the female royal hierarchy. First choice should have been hers, Marie Claire. But here is what the public did not fully understand at the time, and what took months to become clear. Having first choice is not the same as getting everything. Queen Elizabeth had spent years carefully organizing her collection. She had thought about who would wear what. She had thought about which pieces suited which women. She had thought, most of all, about the future of the monarchy, about the woman who would one day sit beside a King George VII, about the woman who was already being called, quietly, by those inside the palace, the future of the firm. That woman was Catherine. Reports emerged in September 2022 that Catherine was expected to inherit around $110 million worth of jewelry from the Queen's personal collection. $110 million. In diamonds, in sapphires, in pearl and gold and platinum pieces that had lived inside velvet cases in palace vaults for decades. The number was almost impossible to comprehend. And when it settled into the public consciousness, it raised an immediate question. If Catherine was receiving $110 million in jewelry, what exactly was Camilla getting? Stylecaster. The tension between Camilla and Catherine had been a quiet, persistent feature of royal life for years before the Queen died. It was never loud. It was never the kind of tension that produced shouting matches in palace hallways or dramatic exits caught on camera. It was the kind of tension that lives in small gestures and careful words, in who stands where at a state occasion, and who is photographed beside whom. Camilla had made her peace, publicly at least, with the fact that Catherine was enormously popular, arguably more popular than anyone else in the royal family in the years after the Queen herself. But private peace and private feeling are not always the same thing. According to a royal insider quoted at the time, the Queen's decision for Catherine to inherit such a significant portion of her jewelry led to resentment from Camilla. "Kate is clearly the family favorite," the insider said. "She'd never say it, of course, but it's one of the reasons Camilla resented Kate." This was not a small claim. This was a royal insider saying directly that the woman who had become Queen of England harbored real, personal resentment toward her daughter-in-law. Not manufactured tension for tabloid consumption. Real feeling rooted in something specific, rooted in large part in the diamonds. Stylecaster, to understand why this hurt the way it did, you have to understand what those diamonds represented to Camilla. She had spent years being told she was not good enough. She had been the villain in one of the greatest love stories of the 20th century, the woman who had come between Charles and Diana, the woman the British public had despised for decades. She had endured it quietly. She had built herself back up. She had worked tirelessly on behalf of causes she cared about. She had, at enormous personal cost, earned something resembling acceptance. And then, in September 2022, she had stood in Westminster Abbey and been crowned queen. That was supposed to be the moment when everything was settled. The moment when the royal establishment confirmed, officially, that Camilla belonged. But jewelry is not just decoration inside the royal family. Jewelry is continuity. Jewelry is lineage. Jewelry is the physical, tangible proof that you are part of something that stretches back through centuries. When a monarch leaves her diamonds to someone specific, she is saying, this person carries the tradition forward. This person is the future. And when the lawyers sat down and confirmed what the late queen had arranged, when the details of the inheritance became official, the message that came through was unmistakable. Elizabeth had chosen Catherine. The specific pieces at the center of this story matter enormously, because they were not ordinary jewelry. They were historic artifacts, with names and histories and decades of meaning attached to them. It was reported that Catherine inherited the Cartier Greville chandelier earrings from Elizabeth's collection, a pair of magnificent jewels that Catherine had first been seen wearing at the wedding of Crown Prince Hussein and Rajwa Al Saif in 2023. These earrings were not simply beautiful objects. They were the kind of piece that a queen wears to signal occasion, to signal gravity, to signal that a moment matters. The fact that they went to Catherine, rather than staying in Camilla's hands, was meaningful to those who watched the royal family closely. The list. Camilla, for her part, had never had her ears pierced, which meant that certain pieces in Elizabeth's collection, particularly the earrings, were always going to go to other members of the family. That practical reality meant that the split in the collection was, in some ways, natural. Camilla could not wear earrings she was not physically equipped for. But the overall shape of the inheritance, the scale of what went to Catherine compared to what went to Camilla, was not something that could be explained away by practical considerations alone. The list. After the Queen's passing, Camilla inherited a significant collection of the late Queen's brooches. Brooches are beautiful, and some of Elizabeth's were extraordinary pieces, but brooches are not diamonds. Brooches are not the kind of jewelry that gets worn to coronations and state banquets and the most photographed moments in royal history. Brooches are not the kind of thing that signals unmistakably that you are the future. Something about rocks. The diamond collection, the real diamonds, the historic pieces, the tiaras and the sweets and the necklaces that generations of queens had worn before, those were going to Catherine. The lion's share of Queen Elizabeth's extensive jewelry collection, according to reports, would go to Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The language was clear. The lion's share, not an equal division, not a careful splitting of the collection between the two senior women in the royal family. The lion's share going to one person. Going to Catherine. Marie Claire. Inside the palace, the conversations that followed were not comfortable ones. The royal family does not air its grievances publicly. That is one of the foundational rules of the institution. Whatever happens internally stays internal, at least officially. But royal courts have always leaked, and this one was no different. The people who worked in those gilded rooms and walked those polished corridors, the people who attended the meetings and observed the body language and noticed who was not speaking to whom, those people talked. And what they said painted a picture of a woman who felt, despite everything she had achieved, that she was still being treated as an outsider. Insiders described how the Queen's jewelry decisions had reinforced existing tensions, with Camilla feeling the weight of being passed over in favor of a woman who had been part of the family for a shorter time. That dynamic, being outranked in terms of seniority, but passed over in terms of the late Queen's personal affection, was one that Camilla had little ability to challenge publicly. She could not call a press conference and say she felt wronged. She could not go on record criticizing the decisions of the woman she had served beside. She was a queen, and queens do not complain. They endure. Stylecaster. But enduring is its own kind of statement, and those who were close to her in that period said the endurance was taking a toll. What made the situation particularly complicated was the question of what Elizabeth had intended versus what had been legally formalized. As everything about the Queen's will was private, the exact distribution of pieces was not publicly confirmed. Only pieces that were subsequently worn or displayed publicly gave any indication of who had received what. That privacy meant that the full picture emerged slowly, piece by piece, as members of the royal family appeared at public engagements wearing items from Elizabeth's collection. Every time Catherine appeared in a historic piece that had once belonged to the late Queen, it was another quiet confirmation of how the inheritance had fallen. The jewelry editor. And Catherine appeared in those pieces often. The Princess of Wales has worn multiple pieces from Queen Elizabeth's personal collection at major public engagements, including at events as significant as the Commonwealth Day service in 2025. Each appearance was a statement. Each appearance said, without words, that these pieces now belonged to her, that she was their new custodian, that the chain of royal history that had run through Elizabeth's jewelry collection was now running through Catherine's hands. Natural diamonds. For Camilla, watching that unfold in public had to have been a specific kind of difficult. She had done everything that was asked of her. She had been patient when patience was demanded. She had been dignified when dignity was the only option. She had buried the version of herself that the public once despised and built something new in its place. And yet here was the clearest possible statement from the woman whose approval had mattered most, from Elizabeth herself, speaking from beyond her death through the careful arrangement of her most precious possessions, that the woman she trusted with the future was not the one who sat on the throne, but the one who would someday. It is important to be precise about what happened and what did not happen. There was no public breakdown. There was no dramatic exit from a palace meeting that was photographed or filmed. The title of this story uses the word "storms out," and what that captures is not a specific scene but a specific feeling. The feeling of a woman who has absorbed something deeply unwelcome and removed herself from the situation rather than perform an equanimity she did not feel. The people closest to Camilla in this period described her reaction in various ways, but the common thread was the same. She was not calm about it. She was not unbothered. The confirmation of the legal arrangements, which experts confirmed had been organized by Elizabeth well in advance, with everything sorted and planned by the Queen some time before her death, did not land softly. Marie Claire. That deliberate, advanced planning was in some ways the most pointed detail of all. Elizabeth had not made these decisions in her final days in the fog of age and illness. She had made them clearly, carefully, and with time to reconsider. She had chosen Catherine with intention. That was the part that could not be explained away or softened. The Queen had thought about it and decided. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stands to inherit the most significant portions of the late Queen's jewelry, as she is positioned to eventually become Queen Consort when Prince William ascends the throne. That inheritance, already substantial, will only grow as time moves forward. The diamond pieces she has already received are the beginning, not the end. When William becomes king, the full weight of the royal jewel tradition will shift further in her direction. The tiaras, the historic suites, the pieces that only a reigning monarch's consort can appropriately wear, they will make their way to her, one formal occasion at a time. Something about rocks. Camilla, meanwhile, carries a crown that took longer than any crown in modern history to reach her head, and she wears it with a composure that the people who once burned her photographs might find genuinely surprising. She has proven something that very few people believed she could prove, that she is capable of being royal in the deepest, most sustained sense. She shows up. She does the work. She does not let the hard days show. But this particular hard day, the day the lawyers made official what Elizabeth's arrangements had long implied, was one she did not greet with composure. This was the day the ledger came due, and the numbers were not what she had expected. The diamonds were going elsewhere. The most visible, most historic, most photographed pieces of the most celebrated jewelry collection in the world were going to the woman who had never been a mistress, who had never been the scandal, who had never had to fight for a single inch of her place in this family, the way Camilla had fought for every single one of hers. That is the story of the diamonds, not a story of villains or victories. A story about what it costs to spend decades earning a place in a family that, in the end, was always going to give its most beautiful things to the future rather than to the past. The diamonds are with Catherine now, and the palace, as always, moves forward. The stones do not mourn, only the people who wanted them do.